Hawke's Redemption, The Forgoten Clone. Disclaimer: this story deals with PTSD, drug abuse, depression, and death. Continue if you will, but be noted. CC 6291, or Hawke as he was once called, stumbled through the dark alleys of a nameless outer rim world, his mind clouded by the toxic haze of spice. The potent drug was his only refuge from the relentless nightmares that plagued him. Nightmares of blaster fire, of screams, of his brothers turning on their Jedi general in an instant. He had survived the initial chaos of Order 66, but it left him scarred in ways the Kaminoans never intended. He found a hidden corner and slumped against a rusted wall, fingers trembling as he reached into his tattered cloak and pulled out a small vial of spice. The burn of shame mixed with the familiar anticipation of numbness as he tipped the vial's contents into his mouth. The world blurred around him, the edges of his vision darkening as his pain melted into an almost comforting void. He was a clone without a purpose, a soldier with no war to fight. The Empire didn't need men like him anymore. They hunted down and disposed of any remaining clones that hadn't succumbed to their programming. Most of his brothers followed orders to the letter, their minds twisted by the biochip embedded in their brains. But not Hawke. For reasons he couldn't fathom, his chip had failed, leaving him fully conscious as the massacre unfolded. He had watched in horror as his squad, men he considered brothers, had gunned down their Jedi commander, Master Tyra Kell. She was more than a leader to him. She had seen him as more than just a number, a weapon. He had loved her in a way he couldn't express. When the clones turned on him, he'd barely escaped with his life, fleeing through the chaos of blaster fire and betrayal. Since then, he'd been on the run, haunted by the memories of that day. Spice was the only thing that kept him from losing his mind completely. He drifted into a restless sleep, the drug pulling him into a stupor. The alleyway faded, and the dream began again. He was back on Kessel, Master Kell at his side, her lightsaber a beacon of hope in the darkness. Then the call came through, the coded words that shattered his world. Execute Order 66. Blaster bolts erupted around them. His brothers moved as one, raising their rifles. He screamed, begged them to stop, but they were already firing. Master Kell's saber flashed, deflecting some of the shots, but she was overwhelmed. A bolt struck her in the chest. The light in her eyes dimmed as she looked at him, reaching out as she fell. "Why?" was all she managed to say before the darkness took her. Hawke woke with a start, his heart racing, sweat soaking his grimy clothes. He groaned, the dream lingering in his mind like a fresh wound. There was no escaping it, no matter how much spice he consumed. His supply was running low, but he didn't care. He didn't want to feel anymore, didn't want to remember. A sharp pain lanced through his side, and he realized he'd been gripping his blaster in his sleep. He released it, his hand shaking. The alley was empty, save for a stray vulture droid picking through the refuse. He needed to find more spice, anything to push back the tide of guilt and regret that threatened to drown him. He stumbled out of the alley and into the chaotic bustle of the street. It didn't take long to find a dealer, a Weeke who eyed him with suspicion, but took his credits without a word. The spice was weaker than what he was used to, but it didn't matter. He found a secluded spot behind a half-collapsed building and took another dose, his body relaxing as the drug took hold. The numbness was almost complete, but the memory still seeped through the cracks. The faces of his squad haunted him, Cutter, Ridge, Skell. Each of them had turned on him without hesitation, their eyes blank, their voices devoid of emotion as they called him a traitor and fired on him. He had been forced to kill them to survive, the only brothers he had ever known. He wasn't a soldier anymore, just a broken relic of a forgotten war. He stared at the blaster in his hand, considering it. The weapon felt heavy, almost unbearably so. He lifted it, pressing the cold barrel against his temple. Maybe it was time to end it, to silence the ghosts forever. But something stopped him. A tiny spark of resistance, the last remnants of his training. He lowered the blaster, breathing hard, his vision swimming. He wasn't sure how much more he could take, how many more nights he could endure the dreams and the guilt. The days blurred together, an endless cycle of pain and fleeting relief. Hawke's world had shrunk to the confines of his dilapidated safe house, a crumbling building in the shadow of Coronet City. The once vibrant metropolis now seemed a distant memory, its bustling streets and towering spires replaced by a fog of numbness and despair. His routine was simple: wake up, try to eat, then reach for the small stash of spice hidden under the loose floorboard beneath his cot. It was a potent blend, cheap, toxic, and effective. The high came fast and hard, numbing the constant ache in his chest and the guilt that gnawed at his mind. For a few blissful hours, he could forget the screams, the betrayal, the look in Master Kel's eyes as the troopers turned on her. But the high never lasted long enough. The crash was brutal, slamming into him with a force that left him gasping and trembling. The memories would come rushing back, vivid and unforgiving. He'd see his brothers, his friends, raising their blasters, their faces blank and unfeeling. He'd hear the harsh bark of Commander Reese's voice, issuing the order, and the silence that followed as they executed it without question. Every time he closed his eyes, he relived it. The flash of green as Master Kel's lightsaber snapped to life, the desperation in her voice as she called his name. He'd frozen, unable to move, his body locked in place as she fought against the onslaught. And then, when the others turned on him, he had to defend himself. He'd left her and his lifeless brothers, left them all, his heart pounding with fear and confusion as he fled into the chaos. Now, years later, the guilt was suffocating. He knew it wasn't his fault, knew it on some logical level, but that didn't stop the nightmares. The Empire had branded him a traitor, a fugitive. The clones who'd survived Order 66 were being hunted down, systematically erased by the very government they'd once served. Hawke had spent the first few months on the run, hiding in the Outer Rim, scraping by on odd jobs and stolen credits. But it was never enough. The memories haunted him, driving him to the edge. He'd tried to fight it, tried to stay clean, but the pain was too much. The spice was the only thing that dulled it, even if just for a while. He stared at the small vial in his hand, his fingers trembling. It was almost empty. He knew he shouldn't, knew that each hit was eating away at him, making it harder to keep going. But he needed it. Just one more hit to silence the voices, to drown out the screams. His comlink buzzed, the sharp sound startling him. He stared at it, his mind sluggish and hazy. No one called him, not anymore. He wasn't sure if he was more surprised by the sound or by the fact that he still had the device at all. Slowly he reached for it, his hands shaking. The message was garbled, distorted, but he could make out the urgency in the voice. "Founder, Imperial facility, need help." He frowned, trying to focus. His mind was clouded, the spice dulling his senses. "What?" "Capture Jedi. Need someone with your skills. Coordinates attached." A Jedi. His heart skipped a beat, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through the haze. His mind raced, the memories crashing over him in a dizzying wave. Could it be? No, it couldn't. Master Kel was gone. He knew that. But if there was a chance, if he could save someone, maybe. He shook his head, the fog lifting slightly. His fingers tightened around the comlink, the familiar weight of duty settling on his shoulders. He was no longer a soldier, no longer the man he'd once been, but he couldn't ignore this. He couldn't let another Jedi fall. His gaze shifted to the vial in his hand. The urge was still there, clawing at his mind, but he pushed it down, forcing himself to stand. He stumbled, his legs weak and unsteady, but he gritted his teeth, focusing on the mission. He'd failed once, but maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference now. He strapped on his old armor, the plates scuffed and worn. It felt foreign, heavy, but it brought a strange sense of comfort, a reminder of who he used to be. The blaster he'd kept hidden under the floorboards was cool and familiar in his grip, its weight anchoring him to the present. Taking a deep breath, he pulled up the coordinates on his data pad. The facility was on the outskirts of the city, heavily guarded. It would be a suicide mission, especially in his current state. But he didn't care. If he could save her, if he could do something right after all the wrong he'd done, it would be worth it. He glanced around the dingy room, his eyes lingering on the cot, the scattered vials, the wreckage of his life. This was his last chance. If he survived, maybe he'd have a reason to keep going. And if he didn't, well, at least he'd go down fighting. All right, he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. One more mission. The comlink buzzed again, a reminder of the urgency. He tucked it into his belt, his movements stiff but determined. The pain was still there, the memories still sharp and brutal, but he could push through it. He had to. Stepping out into the night, he pulled his helmet on, the familiar hiss of the seal locking into place. The streets were quiet, the city lights casting long shadows as he made his way toward the rendezvous point. His heart pounded with a strange mix of fear and determination. The rebellion had found him, had reached out despite everything. Maybe they saw something in him worth saving, something he'd long since lost. He wasn't sure, but he'd answer the call. For the Jedi, for Master Kel, for all the brothers he'd lost along the way. As he moved through the darkened alleys, the memories surged again, but this time he didn't flinch. He embraced them, let them fuel his resolve. He wasn't running anymore. Not from his past, not from the Empire, not from himself. He was going to save that Jedi. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way to save himself. The plan was simple, but risky. The rebellion's intel suggested that the Jedi was being held in a high-security Imperial facility on the outskirts of the city. The place was a fortress, bristling with troopers and automated defenses. Hawke and the small team of rebels were to infiltrate through a maintenance tunnel, bypass the main security checkpoints, and extract the prisoner before the Imperials knew what hit them. Hawke's nerves were frayed as they gathered in the dingy, abandoned warehouse serving as their staging area. His hands shook slightly as he checked his blaster, the familiar weight a small comfort. It was surreal, gearing up for a mission after all these years. He felt like a ghost, a shadow of the soldier he'd once been. "Hey, you all right?" The rebel from the holocron, Tassira, he'd learned, looked at him with concern. Her leku twitched nervously, her fingers tapping a rapid rhythm against the barrel of her blaster. "Yeah," he lied, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Just getting back in the groove." She gave him a skeptical look but didn't press. "We're moving out in 5. Make sure you're ready." Hawke nodded, his gaze drifting to the group of rebels gathered nearby. They were young, so damn young. Barely more than kids, most of them. He saw the mix of fear and determination in their eyes, the way they whispered to each other, checking gear and exchanging last-minute reassurances. He felt like an outsider, a relic from another time. These rebels were fighting for freedom, for a future. He wasn't sure what he was fighting for anymore. Maybe redemption, maybe just an end to the nightmares. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the galaxy far, far away. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and to support the channel, check out my Ko-Fi page at ko-fi.com/tales from the holocron. May the Force be with you always.